Hello and welcome to this free tutorial on how to create this basalt looking rock formation procedurally inside Houdini. We will be using labs tools such as the tri-planar displace tool, which allows us to create some interesting rock shapes, and I'll be showing you how to modify it to prevent getting any artifacts in the edges. We'll also be looking at how to generate this base shape that we're using to apply these procedural textures to. Using just a few nodes doesn't require much to produce this procedurally, and we are able to very quickly randomize the formations. We will also be looking at how to use Bridge by Quixel. I'll show you how we can quickly get that set up and running with Houdini so that we can very quickly apply these seamless procedural textures to any model we want without having to do any UVs, which obviously makes this type of workflow really useful because it's very fast and it means that we can iterate quickly. Let's jump right into it. All right, starting with an empty scene. I'm going to drop down the geo container and name this basalt. I'm going to drop down the grid, and as you can see, I have my wireframe enabled, which you can enable here, or you can use Shift W, turn it off and on. I'm going to keep it on so I know what I'm working with. In the grid, we are going to remove the rows and the columns down to 2. Then we are going to use a scatter node to drop down some points randomly on the grid. And then we are going to use a Voronoi fracture, which takes in geometry to fracture our grid, and then it also takes in some points for the cells. Visualize that. You can see where there is a point, it has used it as the center of a cell to create these really interesting shapes, which you see all over nature, particularly with basalt. So to make this a bit more interesting, we are going to be using a noise on the grid to make sure that the points aren't so uniformly distributed, to hopefully get some bigger shapes and some smaller shapes. So I'm going to use a subdivide to give us some more geometry to work with, something like 5 and higher, 8. That means that we can then use a node called attribute noise to quickly get some color, which we can then use in our scatter to control our density of where the points are being scattered. If we enable density and put in CD here, then the next thing would be to turn off relax, so we like them bunching up. Then if we visualize this Voronoi fracture, you can see almost immediately we're getting more interesting shapes. I'm going to turn down the amount of points I'm scattering, and I'm going to say that's good for now. We're then going to drop down a node called color gradient, which is a labs tool. So if you can't see it, then just make sure you have side effects labs tools updated. So to do that, if you go over to the shelf here, you can then hit update tool set and you'll be able to see all these nodes. So this color gradient node, we're going to set axis to X. That gives us a nice ramp from 0 to 1 across the X axis. We are then going to be using this ramp. We're going to remap it to our own custom ramp. We're going to be using this to control the height that we give each of these pieces to create lots of little towers. So that might not be explaining it very well, so I'm just going to show you instead. First thing we do is rename the custom attribute. Instead of CD, we're going to be calling it x-axis. Then in the wrangle, we are going to be initializing an attribute, a float attribute called height, which for now we're just going to set to x-axis. Next, we're going to drop down a for each primitive, which will iterate through each primitive. And we're going to be looking for this height attribute, which currently is set to points. We want it to be on primitives. So we can do that by using attribute promote before the for each, which we're going to read in this height. And we're going to take it from point to primitive, and it's just going to average out the values. So now we have height here in primitives. So you can see I just needed to visualize this end block to refresh it. Next, we're going to use the poly extrude node. And this poly extrude is what's going to extrude these towers. See if you can see if I enable extruded front, set it to global, and I pull this up, you can see we have our tower. At the moment it hasn't got base. I'm not sure we'll need a base, but just to be sure, we're going to enable output back. So for now, it's just setting all of the towers to the same value. As you can see here, but we don't want them all to be the same. We want them to be the same as our height attribute instead, which we will control and randomize. So to set it to our height attribute, we are going to be using the primitive expression. So we're going to use prim, open brackets. You can see here this help card will come up in case you wanted to know what I'm doing here. So the first input is going to be 0, so it's looking for the first input. We are then looking for the primitive number, which in this case is 0 as well. And we are looking for our height attribute, and then the attribute index is 0 because it's just a float. You see straight away, we now have our height attribute controlling the amount of translation we give each segment in the Y. So what that means is if we go back to our wrangle, which we can probably rename now to something like height, and maybe even color it as well, hit C, it'll open up this little color dialog where you can use this. And I am going to remap height, F at height equals custom ramp, channel ramp, which I'm going to name to remap. And we are looking for our height attribute. Semicolon. Hit this, now have our ramp. That means if I was visualizing this, you can see I'm able to control the amount of extrusion I give these fragments based on the x-axis. So I probably want to make it do like a sharp incline, something like this. However, I want to be able to control the min and the max. So to do that, we are going to wrap this channel ramp in a fit 01. Because this channel ramp is outputting 0 to 1. You can see these towers aren't going any higher than 1. Fit 01. Then after our channel ramp, we are going to use another custom channel, which is a float, which we're going to call min height. Close that off. And then another channel called max height. And close off the fit. If we hit this, we now have control for the min height and the max height. So you can see I can pull this up now and also make sure that even the bottom ones have a bit of height added to them. There you have it. That is a very basic setup. Straight away though, I am immediately seeing how these could all benefit from some randomization. So to do that, we are going to be using the rand function to slightly offset this height. So after our custom function, we are going to be resetting f height to plus equals. We're just going to add a value back to it. Plus equals, and we are going to use the rand function like I said. So rand is going to give us a random number from 0 to 1. The seed we're going to use is pt num, which is the point number. So at the moment, it's going from 0 to 1, like I said, but we probably want to have control over how much it can randomly offset. So to do that, we are going to multiply it by another custom float called mult. which if we enable here, we can then control the amount of randomization that we're going to be giving. Next, we're going to apply materials to this geometry. And to do that, we're going to use Quixel's Bridge software. If you don't have this downloaded already, I'm going to link it down below. And the reason why I'm using it is because it can get photorealistic results very quickly. And once you have Bridge downloaded and the Houdini plugin installed, we are able to get material set up very quickly. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. So like I said, I already have the Megascans plugin installed. I'm going to get it running, and you may have a blank UI. If that's the case, like I did, all you need to do is make a few changes to some of the Python scripts that you have within your Megascans folder structure. And this thread outlines how you can quickly make the changes necessary to get the UI working again. Hopefully they fix this problem soon, but I'll link this down below just in case you have the same issue as me. So now that we have the plugin running, I'm just going to switch the material type to tri-planar. And I'm just going to minimize that. Then if I go back over to Bridge, let's assume that I've found the material that I like. I believe I've got some already downloaded. I'm going to select the material that I want to get into my Houdini scene. I'm going to use Icelandic rock glyph for now. And I'm just going to hit export. Exported successfully. And if you navigate over to the material section, you can see that it has set up the tri-planar mantra shader for us. So if you view this Quixel node that it's created, you can see all the texture files have been put into the correct sections and are being fed into this principled shader. So let's see what this looks like out the box. To do that, I'm just going to set up this scene ready for rendering. So as you can see, I've just created a camera and an environment light, which I've just read in a environment map, which I'll link down below that you can download for free. And then in my material section, I'm just going to assign that Quixel material that we just imported. And in my art section, I'll just create mantra rock. Defaults are fine, except I'm going to change this to PBR. And I'm just going to change the limits just so we get some faster renders. And we're going to see what that looks like. So out of the box, you can see it doesn't look particularly pretty. That's because we just need to make a few changes to the material. First thing we're going to do is make sure that the displacement is enabled. To do that, we can go over to the displacement tab of the principled shader, just hit custom input. And it's probably going to look like this. Not to worry. I'm just going to fix that by dropping down a luminance. Let's go pause this. Put down a luminance, then a fit. And we're just going to control the amount of displacement that we're getting. So I am going to use a very small number. And then I'm also going to use a negative number in the min, so that we're also pulling in the geometry as much as we're pushing out, which if we look at now, is beginning to work a bit better. The next thing we're going to do is, since our material doesn't have a metal texture map, it's probably going to default metal to 1, which is not what we want, so we're just going to cut that connection. Okay, now it's beginning to behave a bit more as expected. As you can see, it's quite uniform since we're essentially just projecting the same texture so that it's tiling. And the way I'm going to improve this is by layering up some of these materials. Now to do that, I am going to take this displacement map, and then I'm going to go back over to my geometry. And I am going to apply this displacement map to the geometry before we apply another material at render time. And this is just because I want to make the render look a bit more interesting at the end, and I found a good way of doing this just by layering up as many materials as you see fit. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to give ourselves some more topology to work with. So we are going to use a really useful node called voxel mesh. So we're just going to increase the resolution. To do that, we're going to set this to custom, then use a much smaller number. That's giving us some more topology to work with. However, these corners are quite ugly, so we're just going to smooth the geometry as a whole before we apply displacement. And then I am going to use a labs node called tri-planar displace. Visualize that. See, by default, it's using this UV grid. We don't have much topology to work with at the moment, so it's not particularly pretty output. So to help it, we're just going to do a subdivide just before the displacement, just to give us some more geometry. All right, so now we're going to paste in that displacement map that we had downloaded. And you can see with the default settings, it's not particularly pretty. So we're just going to turn down the displacement and amount. I'm not really liking how bloated the geometry is looking post displacement. Ideally, what I want is the displacement to also go inwards as well as outwards, whereas at the moment you can see it's only really happening outwards. So to do that, we're just going to make a few changes to the node. So the first thing we're going to do is allow editing of contents. We're just going to dive inside. Make sure your display flag is set to the end of the network. Then we're going to dive inside the point VOP, and you're probably going to see something like this. We're just going to navigate over to this displace normal node over here. And just before where this add is being channeled into the amount input, we're just going to pop down a fit unclamped. And then in the destination min, we're just going to hit -1 on all the values. So as you can see now, the geometry is also being pulled in, which kind of creates a bit more of a sharper look, which is ideal for rock. So if we go back up, we are going to further improve how this looks. And one of the ways we can do that is by playing with the noise projection offset. And you can see almost immediately that's helping reduce the amount of tiling that we see in the displacement. Now, if you're getting lots of artifacts like I am here, all we need to do is just give the displacement node a bit more geometry to work with. So if you increase the depth, the subdivide, you'll start getting much sharper results. However, for now, I am happy with this resolution. So I am going to go back over to Bridge, and I'm going to download another material that's going to give us a finer level of detail. So for that, I'm going to be using the layered shale beach rock, which I've already downloaded here. I'm just going to hit export. And if we go back to our scene, you can see it has it set up here. We're just going to apply the same changes that we made to the Icelandic rock cliff. Then if we go back to object level, we can change the material to the shell rock. And now if we hit render. So this is the final result. I've just changed a few things. You could definitely play around with these until you end up with the result that you want. One of them being inside the Mantra tri-planar Quixel node is the uniform scale. That essentially controls the amount that you tile a texture. So if we wanted some finer details, then I would increase this number like I have here too. I've also used a power node in the albedo and in the roughness, and that is essentially just giving me a bit more contrast in the texture maps. So you can see I've set it to 1.2 here, and in the roughness I've set it to 2, so I've cranked it quite high. And then for the reflect, by default, this is probably set to 1. However, I thought it'd be good to use the roughness map that we've got. So I've put down a ramp just after the power coming from the roughness, and I have inverted it and also just cranked up the one input so that it's towards the end of the scale. And that's it. I hope you found this tutorial useful. Thank you for watching.